the key problem for the near future for Tesla is China and its COVID policy, which is turning into a power game and is very uncomfortable to observe from outside. People are suffering, people don't have access to food. Maybe it's propaganda, maybe not. Clearly, something is going on, particularly in Shanghai. I want to discuss the situation on two levels. First, on a practical level, what does that mean for Tesla? And what does it mean in generally for a company to produce in China, knowing that they're capable of doing things like they're doing right now in Shanghai? And then second, I want to discuss this also the more, let's say, theoretical level in terms of, let's say, why do we talk so much about blockchain technology? Well, here's a good example. I think in general, we don't care about how things are governed until we care. In other words, for a long time, we've been neglecting the fact that China is a communist dictatorship. I mean, when I say we, of course, I talk about the general public, about Wall Street. And now we do care. Now all of a sudden we're like, wait a minute, these people who run China, they have certain incentives that are absolutely not aligned with ours, and we have to take that into account. And there is a point to be made about decentralized governance. We have the same risk here. COVID has shown us that even here in the U.S., we can stomp on our freedoms and jeopardize things that we took for granted. And those are the kinds of things I want to discuss a little bit more theoretical in the context of blockchain technology. This is not even on podcast. It's April 13th, 2022. This is Krim Delco. Since the last update, we're up 4%. The market's up 1.5%. For the year, we are down 11.6%. The market is down 6.6%. We are underperforming by 5%. The market's still open, so there is still potential for change in these numbers. I think let's start with the practical side of this conversation. China is the problem. I spoke about this in my last episode. China is a problem because they are shutting down Shanghai, apparently in the name of COVID and the zero COVID policy. And let's first talk about what's actually going on the ground. So the city is locked down. There are basically lots of areas of the city of Shanghai where people can't leave their house. There's some areas where they can leave their house for a certain amount of time. Factories are shut down. The Tesla factory is shut down. In general, the problem here is that we can't produce cars and we can't sell them in Shanghai, but particularly we can't produce them, which is, of course, a big problem. This is a large factory. Tesla has put a lot of equity, a lot of intellectual property, a lot of future hope, a lot of emotional property, all these kinds of things that come with a company like Tesla were invested in Shanghai. The proposition was that you have a very efficient country that can produce things at scale, and that you should trust this country to do everything in their power to make this production at scale even easier in the future. And now we're faced with a situation where you can't produce at all. And the reason for that is COVID. What exactly is going on, we don't know. It could be really just zero COVID policy. If you analyze this a little bit more in detail, then you realize that probably doesn't make sense, because we have so many examples now around the world where having a more relaxed, if not completely open policy towards this pandemic is actually a lot more efficient for many ways, in particular also in dealing with the pandemic itself. In other words, if you have a more open attitude towards the pandemic, then you also create herd immunity and all these kinds of things. Maybe you can combine it with vaccines. Maybe you can throw in a little bit of isolation here and there. But in general, being more open actually helps this virus. More theoretically, of course, if you think about it, this is nature. For us humans to fight nature is not possible. We can't fight. This is like fighting hurricanes or fighting floods. They do happen. We have to live with them. It is a lot better and a lot easier to adapt to them than to pretend that they don't exist. Zero COVID policy in that sense is almost an oxymoron. It just doesn't work. You can't execute something like that at scale for a long time. In general, also what's happening here, I would say, rises the risk for China itself and for the ruling parties in China to be displaced, because once you take away people's ability to eat and the ability to raise their kids, in any kind of normal, natural fashion, then they become very violent. So why am I saying that? Well, there's been rumors or news or even anecdotes that, let's say, kids are being separated from families if they test positive, and those kinds of things. And just one more terrible social aspect of this is that, let's say, if you have you live on a block, and this is, again, I don't know if this is true, but it's certainly it's an anecdote that is concerning, even if it's just an anecdote. So the way it works in Shanghai is that certain blocks are being opened up. So they're being opened up for, let's say, a light way of moving around. So you're not completely locked down, but you have to have a zero COVID policy in that particular block. So what happens now? Of course, everybody's looking at everybody else. And God forbid, if one family did something and got infected, and then the whole block gets shut down again. So this type of looking over your shoulder and making sure everybody abides to the policies of the government is just terrible social interaction, a terrible social, how should I say, social incentive system, which creates this system of ratting on other people, making sure everybody abides to the rule. My point here is that if this is intentional by the central government of Beijing to create a more power structure driven rule of Shanghai, then they're absolutely succeeding. Again, I don't know if this is intentional. Maybe this is just a pandemic response, or maybe this is actually a power show, a show of power and a show of suppressing a potential uprising. And this is now my conjecture, that maybe there has been some instability within the power structure of China, particularly Shanghai as being the most advanced, most capitalist town in China. And maybe this is a way for Beijing to clamp down on those types of movements. Having said all of that now, what that means for Tesla in particular is Tesla needs to find a way to keep producing cars. They can do that in a bubble, the same way CATL is doing it in Shenzhen. So they can basically do a deal with the government where they say, okay, our people will work in the factory, they'll stay in the factory, the suppliers, everybody will be sort of in a bubble, a little bit like the bubble that we had, let's say, when the NBA started or the MLS started back a year and a half ago or so. When they restarted after the pandemic, they were in a bubble, so everybody got tested. The same way also the Olympics in China, they were in a bubble. Everything was in a bubble. So something like that can happen. I think this is something that hopefully also Elon Musk is involved in. This is important for Tesla not to be able to produce cars for a couple of weeks, if not months, in Shanghai would be very, very detrimental for growth, for demand, for inflation, for all the kinds of things that any kind of government cares about around the world, including the Chinese government. So having said that, now let's talk a little bit more about the theoretical implication of this central versus decentral governance. So first, let's talk about decentralization in general. So we talk a lot about this with Bitcoin and Ethereum and other blockchains. And I think a lot of people kind of like this idea of decentralization, but they don't really care who runs what, because all they care about is efficiency, speed, performance, latency, cost. Those are the kinds of things people really care about. Most people don't care about who governs what. The same applies to our just daily lives, let's say here in the US or in Europe and in China. So we don't really care about who runs San Francisco, who's the mayor, what is the structure, all these kinds of civic things that we're supposed to care about, that we learn about in school. Most people don't care. If I ask somebody, do you know what is written in the Constitution of the United States? Do you know how the city of San Francisco is run, or do you know how the city of Baltimore is run, or what the law is and the structure and all these kinds of things? And most people would just basically say, I don't really care. All I care about is that whatever I need to get done gets done. People, of course, care about things like property rights, but only to the extent that they're being in jeopardy. As soon as they feel like the property rights are being granted, that they don't have to deal with the risk of losing them, they don't care about them. So my point here is that this whole conversation, let's say in terms of China, has been, well, yeah, they're a communist party, they're central planning, this and that, who cares? China is growing, China is turning into a capitalist society, China is actually opening up creativity people are able to create. There's companies, TikTok, Shine, and other companies, but those two are the most prevalent new startups that are penetrating actually back to the West, which is a new thing. China hasn't been able to do that for a long time, actually forever, maybe ever since Tencent and maybe Alibaba a little bit. But we haven't seen companies really succeed coming out of China, and we see that now. So all of these things were kind of, yeah, it's all good, it's all great, we're all happy, and all that stuff. And now we're all of a sudden faced with a situation where we realize that China is a brutal dictatorship, centrally planned, and that there is a risk of irrational behavior by the central planners. This is the main problem. This is what we're facing right now. And that's all of a sudden now we care about who runs China, how China is run, what is the political situation, what are the property rights. And the answer is there is no rights. Basically what this Shanghai situation is showing us is that there is no rights whatsoever in China. They can do whatever they want with people. They lock them down, they take away, they separate families, they do all kinds of things that are unheard of in the Western world. And I think Wall Street has to take that into account. It's being taken into account. The sell-off in Chinese stocks is one of the implications of that. I think we as investors in Tesla, we've always raised that question, of course, is it wise to be in China? And the answer has been for a long time, if you want to succeed in the electric car business, you need to be in China for two reasons. One is it's the largest market, largest growing market. And second, the main risk of disruption comes from there. So you need to be there and compete. That's still, all of these things hold true, but we have underestimated the risk of governance. We kind of took for granted that there's something like a Chinese Communist Party. They run the country, they know what they're doing. Well, it looks like they don't know what they're doing because they are just about destroying what they've built in the last 3 or 4 decades since Deng Xiaoping's opening up of China, because they are destroying this belief that you can do business in China. As simple as that. And it's not coming from a place that we thought it might come from, things like property rights or that kind of thing. It comes from the most basic thing of all, which is human rights. They just lock you up because they want to. The pretext is COVID. Tomorrow it can be something else. And this is a concern that we just have to take very seriously. How to deal with it? I think Tesla is doing what they need to do, diversifying. There is a potential non-zero probability that we have a situation where Tesla actually closes their shop in China for good. It's non-zero, that means it's not high. Hopefully it will not happen, but it's still something we need to be aware of. And this situation in Shanghai, unfortunately, is just showing in a very clear and non-convoluted way that there is a regime in place which is maximizing for one thing, which is power. Above human rights, above economic growth, above anything. And this is something that we've discussed also within the context of Russia and what Putin is doing. This idea that economic growth and economic prosperity is above all, which has been governed since the fall of the Berlin Wall. So since the late 1980s, we have been living under the premise that economic growth and prosperity is the number one factor that everybody is maximizing for. Dictator, non-dictator, doesn't matter. Corrupt, non-corrupt, doesn't matter. It's the economy, stupid, was the slogan when Bill Clinton got elected. Anybody in the US who runs anything is usually measured by things like jobs, prosperity, stock market. The same applies to most countries, including Asian countries, China, and it used to apply also for Russia. That now has changed. Russia has been the most direct example of a place where the leaders, in particular Vladimir Putin, don't care about the economy, they care about power. And what's happening in China now, unfortunately, is the same thing. What they're doing in Shanghai is putting other priorities on top of economic prosperity. Now, in the long run, that doesn't work. In the long run, if people are hungry, people can't raise their kids properly, they go to the streets. You can suppress people only to the point where suppressing people is actually is forging them, making them more iron and building a resistance which eventually will come back and haunt you. This is what people suppression does to any country, even in North Korea. Eventually, this regime will collapse. The North Korean regime cannot last. It's not possible to last. You might last 1 or 2 or 3 leader periods. At some point, it will collapse because the amount of control and resources you need for every new layer of suppression is disproportionately high. So this is a sort of reverse exponential growth. In other words, if you want to create a complete controlled government like North Korea, you have to starve out half the population, and then the next guy who runs it has to starve out the other 50% left, and so and at some point there's nobody left anymore to control, and you basically collapse. So this is the reality, and you don't have the luxury. You don't have the luxury to suppress people for a long term. But right now we're in this period of time where that seems to be what people are doing. They're doing in Russia, they're doing in China. I think it's part of this whole COVID policy that we've been all subject to, where all of a sudden we put something else on top. We locked down our cities, we took away human rights, even in our Western societies, in the name of something else. And now we can just switch that something else. We can say, well, how about we switch COVID for climate change or racism or whatever. You just name it, and then you start taking away people's freedoms. Playing around with the concept of human rights. And you open the Pandora's box of having those rights not observed in the name of something else. You're lost. And this is, unfortunately, again, this is a situation we have to live with right now. As investors, I think we're at a crossroads where it can either go be a wake-up call, and it can forge us to even be more extreme in sort of decentralization and liberties, and this is what the blockchain community is doing, and that's a good thing. Or it can put us back to the dark ages, where we actually have to go back and fight kinetic wars just to protect our rights. And the third and worst outcome will be that even in our own backyard, we start giving up those rights for other reasons. I don't think this is happening, particularly in the US. I've had an episode a while ago, I'll put in the show notes, where I spoke about that every country eventually is maximizing for something. It turns out that Russia is maximizing for power, China is maximizing for power. We in the US are still obsessed with growth. With freedom, of course. That was a Freudian mispronunciation, probably. We're obsessed with freedom. So we're maximizing for freedom, which is a good thing. It's a good thing. That's a thing that I think it's worth maximizing for. And freedom comes in many facets. And one of them is we have to find ways to make decisions where less and less authorities are involved. This is what blockchain technology does. This was also the answer to my question, what would Elon Musk do if he started Twitter from scratch? The problem is, how do we create systems that govern us and we don't have authorities governing us? Because authorities seem to fall back into this vicious circle of trying to maximize for power, or at least protect their power, which can be the same thing at some point. So this is probably going to be the battle of the coming 2 decades when it comes to power. Power is back on the agenda. The Shanghai situation is showing that. At Orange Capital Partners, we have direct investments in blockchain technologies, but we believe that the entrepreneurial spirit and the power of people like Elon Musk and others to drive growth, to maximize for freedom, to put people first, that all those vectors are still way, way stronger than this idea that we put individual power or the power of a party above other things. This is our belief. We have some evidence still that that is the case, But we have to acknowledge the risk that it might change. So to summarize, the situation in China has a practical implication. Tesla has to find a way to produce cars. They can do that by building a bubble system and produce, and we hope that that can happen in the next couple of weeks. And the theoretical answer to the question, okay, what should we do in the future, is we need to find ways to govern ourselves, to put systems in place, governance systems, where there is some sort of decentralized decision mechanism, or at least less authoritarian decision mechanisms in place to go forward. Thank you.